Hi, Mike Holt here with MikeHolt.com. Gonna have a fun night tonight. I got some really cool stuff. We're gonna start off really fun. But first of all, I just want to take a moment to thank God for giving me the opportunity to make a difference in your lives. And hope you guys know I really enjoy doing this. A lot of work, a lot of people doing this, and but you guys are important to me, and I really love you guys. So let's go. All right, ground rods at metal poles. This is a video you want to save and you want to replay. Mike, is a ground rod at a metal pole necessary to protect the luminaire from lightning? Well, you know what? Let's do some background. Ready for this? Number 1, Article 100. Make sure you have your code book. Get your highlighter. Guess what? My tabs are no longer in the plastic container, so we're getting closer. There, just saying. Okay, Article 100, definition of the term ground, the earth. So please, if you ever at any of my seminars, or if you ever hear me say the word ground, I'm only talking about the earth. That means that if you ever say the word ground, you're only talking about the earth. So, looks to me like you got some problems. Because, well, Mike, how are you going to ground that receptacle? Well, that would be a stupid way to say something. Well, I got to make sure I ground this and I do this. Like, unless you're planning on taking it to the dirt, don't use the word ground, okay? So, we'll talk about when we will. We've been talking about this for a while. Ready to go? Okay. Effective ground fault current path. That's a term that's defined in Article 100 as well. Now, the effective ground fault current path is an intentional path created to provide a low impedance path from the point of a ground fault back over to the source, and it's for the purpose of clearing a fault. See, when you have a ground fault that's defined in Article 100, when you have a ground fault, that fault current is returning to the power supply, which is going to be the transformer at some point, either utility transformer, or if you had installed a transformer, to the secondary of that transformer. So that's what the fault current is going to, and if you have a low impedance path from the point of the ground fault to the source, what do you think is going to happen to the current? I is equal to E over R, right? E, electromotive force. We use the word voltage to measure that. I is equal to E, the voltage, over R, the resistance. It's really the impedance, which gets to AC circuits, and that's when we get into theory. We talk about what resistance is and what impedance is and reactance and those kind of things. So now, if you have a low impedance path, effective ground fault current path, what happens? You trip the breaker. So let's take a look at this. If you have a light pole, listen, if you have anything wired with electricity, I don't care what it is, you have to have an effective ground fault current path from that enclosure that contains those conductors. So if we have a light pole, you're running circuit conductors out there, you have to bring an effective ground fault current path to the pole. And we call that an equipment grounding conductor. And if you go to Article 100 and you read the definition of an equipment grounding conductor, Eric Stromberg, my buddy who's on our video team, got that definition revised. And we've talked about that in the past. It's part of that ground fault current path. It's part of the effective ground fault current path. So here we go. We'll bring a circuit out to the light pole or to anything. You have an equipment grounding conductor. In the event of a ground fault current hits that pole. It travels on the equipment grounding conductor back over to the effective ground fault current path. Open the breaker. Nothing is to be a problem. Now, the earth, the dirt itself, just dirt. Go outside, pick up some dirt. Look at that dirt. That's not an effective ground fault current path. That's not intentionally constructed by you. It's not a low impedance path back to the source. So we can never use the dirt to clear a fault. Okay? Now, the code allows you in 250.54 to install a supplemental electrode. To install an auxiliary electrode. I've seen people put auxiliary electrodes next to motors. Oh, you're going to see some other things. There's some other things. I can't remember where I just saw something. Somebody just drove a ground rod next to it. Oh, people put ground rods in pools, around pools. Like, come on. But the code says, listen, if you want to add an auxiliary electrode, 250.54, you can. You know what it also says? There are no rules. Why no rules? Well, because if you don't need to do something, and the code says you can do it, if you don't need to do it, then there's no rules to follow because you don't need to do it. And the code says this about this electrode. It says you don't have to bond it in accordance with 250-50 of bonding all electrodes together. Number two, it says that it doesn't matter what the resistance is of that electrode. So it could be 1,000 ohms or 100 ohms. As a matter of fact, you could drive a 16-penny nail if you want to make your electrode. You can take that 8-foot ground rod or 10-foot ground rod, cut it in third, cut it in half. It doesn't matter. You can just take the wire if you want to, just stick it in the dirt. And not only that, but the code doesn't care what size wire you run to the auxiliary electrode. This is all covered in 250-54. So we don't care what size wire, don't care whether the electrode is there, don't care what the resistance of the electrode is when it contacts to the earth, and it doesn't have to be bonded to anything. See, you had to have a rule covering something that you don't have to do. You're like, why would you have a rule covering something you have to do, telling you don't have to do anything? Because there's people out there thinking you have to do something. So you have to have a rule telling you, listen, you don't have to do anything, okay? You shouldn't even put it in there, by the way. You should never put an electrode that's not required by the code, ever. That's another discussion. Okay, if you drive a ground rod, and let's say that ground rod was 25 ohms, that's the contact resistance. The earth, when I measure ground resistance, we're measuring the contact resistance of that ground rod to the earth. Let's say it was 25 ohms. It might be, it might not be. If it was 25 ohms, Ohm's law. So how many amps would travel, leave the source, travel to the metal pole, energize the metal pole, go to the ground rod, and then travel in the dirt and find a path getting back over the source? If that resistance right here was 25 ohms, well, Ohm's law shows you I equal to E over R, 4.8 amps, right? Guess what? It's not tripping a breaker. It's okay because it's not supposed to trip a breaker. What's not okay is thinking that you can use the earth as an effective ground fault current path. If you're driving ground rods because you're worried about something, you're probably screwing it up because you don't know about the effective ground fault current path. Okay, let's take a look at this light pole. By the way, it was a practice for a long time to not bring an equipment grounding conductor out to light poles, traffic signals and what have you. Well, if you don't bring an equipment grounding conductor out there, guys are driving ground rods because they thought it needed to be grounded, but they brought no equipment grounding conductor. You're never going to clear a fault. And then look what happens here. Here is an auxiliary electrode with no effective ground fault current path, no equipment grounding conductor. There's a ground fault, energize everything. You're going to have current traveling through the ground rod, and you're going to have additional current traveling to the individual, and they can get easily killed by touching the pole. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about that tonight. A young boy playing football gets killed by touching a pole, and there was a ground rod at that pole. I hope tonight's video you will learn something, and you'll be making the world a little safer. And by the way, this is a true story. Male dogs, they have a tendency to kind of, lift up the leg and pee on a pole. Yeah, they've gotten killed before. I don't know about a female dog, but I do know male dogs have gotten killed. Okay. Oh gosh, Brian, I wanted to show a video, and I apologize. I don't think they can see the video from my computer. Can they see a video from my computer? Probably not. Okay, so Brian, see before we end up here, if we can get this video here about the heat pump with no effective ground fault current path. We'll see if we can play that in there. All right, so let's just get back over here to this graphic here. If there's no equipment grounding conductor, there's a ground fault. We talked about the current traveling through the ground rod of about 4.8 amps. If it were 25 ohms, just using an example, which you're not realizing there's going to be a voltage gradient all around that. Guess what? Grounding does not bring anything to a zero potential at all when it comes to ground fault. You're going to have now the earth a voltage gradient, and that could be a potential problem. All right, this young boy, this Georgia boy dies. He is in, I forgot, Augusta, Georgia. I think it was in Augusta, Georgia, yeah. This young boy right here, he jumps on the fence, and he gets killed. Guess what? There was a wire nut inside the metal pole structure. It heated up, it melted, it made contact with a metal enclosure, it energized the enclosure, and guess what? That pole was actually, right there's a ground rod, and there's the acorn fitting right there. So that pole was grounded. And you know what's interesting about this case? I was involved in this case, but I gave it to a buddy of mine to manage because we don't need to get involved in that case. Is that ground rod and that, you see that, by the way, this is called an auxiliary, an electrode. Not required by the code, doesn't really matter, doesn't serve a purpose at all. But people do it because they think it's a good idea. And they had no equipment grounding conductor in the circuit. There was a ground fault, pole became energized. And guess what? 25 years earlier, I think it was 20 years earlier than that, the same thing happened to this exact pole. There was a fault in this exact pole. And a woman got shocked, sued the city, got money, and guess what the city did? They came back here and they ran a new wire and they put a new ground rod. And then 20 years later, this young boy right there dies. Listen, guys, I need you to know what you're doing. You really need to learn electrical theory. You have to have a copy of your code book. You need to, if nothing else, the worst case scenario, you need to get my grounding and bonding book, and you need to get the DVDs. You need to not put yourself in a scenario where, listen, you don't want to know that, you did something like this here, you thought you did a good job, and you found out you killed somebody. How are you going to live with that the rest of your life? This is important. Let's keep going. I can get going. I get going. Okay. Now, this is in Miami, and I was driving by, and I saw these guys driving ground rods with a sledgehammer, with a ground rod driver, and this guy's, listen, these guys got this thing worked out. This is a system here. This is actually in Coral Gables, down in the South Florida area. And Coral Gables implies what it is. It's just a coral rock area. And so driving a ground rod there is pretty difficult, if not almost impossible. Okay? So why are they driving ground rods? You know why? Because the spec showed it. An inspector might come out and say, hey, listen, I don't see a ground rod at your pole. So you might even think you should be putting one there because you've been doing that. You've been told you've been doing that. No. How about this one here? I think Eric Stromberg gave me this one here. Here's a portable generator, and somebody thinks, well, you got to ground the generator. And somebody then takes a 5-gallon bucket, puts some dirt in there, and they get, 3-foot piece, 4-foot, maybe it's a 4-foot piece of ground rod with a wire in there, and they connect it over probably somewhere to the frame of this generator here. Guys, please. How about this? The solar guys. Man, they drive me nuts. Solar people, listen, guys, you're a little different. First of all, there's a couple of reasons solar people are different. Man, to understand electricity backwards, see, we're working off AC and we go power going to loads, where solar guys are they're working backwards. They're actually having power. Instead of being a load, they're going the other way. And it's not AC, it's DC. So you're getting power being generated in DC, then you're converting it with an inverter and taking it over to AC. And the code rules in 690 and 691 and 705 and 706 and 710. Let me tell you something. If you know solar and you really know what you're doing, you get your code book, which not many people really do. Get my solar book here. That is one tough subject. You got to be a smart person to really design solar, to install solar, to inspect solar. It's complicated. But even those smart guys, guess what they think? Look right here, the defense. A ground rod. The solar guys want to see the fence connected to a ground rod. And I'm thinking, the fence is already in the ground. I don't know if they know that, if they even thought about that. And what the heck would you drive a ground rod and connect it to some wire along the fence? What is that all about? Because it isn't going to make a difference. The fence is already in the ground. If the fence became energized because it's likely to become energized, we talked about that before, right? The term likely to become energized, that it has to be connected to an equipment grounding conductor. Well, a ground rod is not going to happen. Okay. Brian, we're still getting to the question about, Mike, is the ground rod at the bottom of a pole? Sorry, I have to go this way. Is the ground rod at the bottom pole intended, maybe not to clear a fault, maybe not to get a zero reference, none of those stuff, but is it there to maybe protect the light fixture? Code calls it a luminaire. Brian, are you ready to go ahead and play that video? All right, let's play that video. I love this video. I wish I could watch it.
Let's review this.
2,000 miles.
The effective ground fault current path in this case is called the equipment grounding conductor. When we had it connected, Carl, remember, and we made this connection here, fault current traveled along the effective ground fault current path back to utility, tripped that breaker, a little bit of spark, not much. I've lost the effective ground fault current path. And what's very common in street lighting parking lot lighting and ball field lighting is they will not bring an effective ground fault current path there. The practice, just the way they've done it for 100 years. They run the phase conductors, which is your hot wires, and then they take a wire and they go over to a ground rod. That's what killed that one boy. You saw the one with the fence? Yes. Well, that's what they did. And 25 years ago, they had the same ground rod, and they almost killed the girl. She sued them. They said they fixed it. All they did was they cleaned the connection of the ground rod, and they left the ground rod there, and then 25 years later, a boy playing football gets to the fence and the pole and gets killed. So now let's see what happens. If you have something that's metal without an effective ground fault current path, and you run a wire over to a ground rod, okay, Dave, you turn it on?
It's on.
Okay, and we turn it on, we'll find out how many amps it's gonna take. That's a 50 amp breaker. Carl, how many amps is that drawing?
0.28.
0.28. Think about this, Carl. We had a conductive wire, copper or aluminum, running all the way back, all the way to the transformer. That was the effective ground fault current. Properly installed, properly terminated, right? It'll clear it. You really think the dirt is going to be a conductor? Because look at it. It was less than 1 amp. Now but now watch what happens. Not only do you have this problem, but you have a ground rod over there. You have a piece of electronic equipment. You have a ground rod over here at the service. Lightning strikes the field. It creates a voltage gradient. Now the electricity will come up that ground rod through the wire that you installed, connect to the equipment over here, going back to the other ground and destroy your equipment. One of the reasons why you never want to drive a ground rod to any piece of equipment. Now let's see what happens though. They lost, or they did not have an effective ground fault current path. They thought, no worries, we'll drive a ground rod. We come over here, we know the current was less than 1 amp, so that's definitely not going to trip a 50 amp breaker. Now look how it happens over here. Here's the ground rod. Brian has created an amazing set of meters here that from this point here to this point right here, I'm standing right now, that is 113 volts. That's what it is. It's 113 volts. If I go here, it's 115. Over here is 116. So there is a voltage in a circle around here going all the way out. So not only did we not clear a fault, but now we created a scenario that we created a much greater area where you could get killed. See, if they brought no effective ground fault current path and they didn't ground it, you could only get killed where? Where could you get killed? If you touched it. Because if that was energized and no effective ground fault current path and you don't clear it, right?
Which it is.
Which it is, and you touch that, you're gonna get killed. But now that they ran a ground, we increased the area. Okay, so we see that grounding equipment and not providing an effective ground fault current path is not going to clear the fault. Yes, you do have some current traveling, and yes, you do have a voltage gradient, so you've expanded the area to kill somebody. You never ever drive a ground rod except where it's required by the National Electrical Code. You always bring an effective ground fault current path to every piece of metal that's connected to equipment. Now, as you'll see when we get to the slides, some of the deaths occur because the wiring itself was pulled out of the connector. And the wiring was the effective ground fault current path. Happened to a young man in Iraq. He was taking a shower. He got killed because the wiring from the generator, military guys, that came to the building, there was the outside sheath was metal, but when they put it in the connector, the metal didn't make contact, so there was no effective ground fault current path. There was a fault in the plumbing pump motor, so every time they turn on the water, it ended up energizing the water piping system, and he got killed because there was no effective ground fault current path. The young boy got killed on the pole because he touched the pole, or he was in a voltage gradient, because they grounded it, purposely grounded. They purposely did not bring an effective ground fault current path because they thought grounding would make it safe. You okay with that, guys? All right, let's go back into the class and let's take a look at some more stuff.
Right. Yeah, we're going to go right here to this picture. Ready? Okay, so you watched that video and we talked about why the young boy got killed, right? And we talked about the people driving ground rods. They must be doing it for a reason. And we talked about kind of crazy concepts of grounding. And we talked about the fence, that people put ground rods in fences. Listen, it's not illegal to drive ground rods where the code doesn't require it. It's just not a good practice because it does give the false impression of safety. Like that young boy that got killed. Those people, by the way, pretty much all ball field lighting probably has no equipment grounding conductor and probably has ground rods to it. So don't be touching ball field lighting. All right, so there's that voltage gradient that was explained a little bit in the video. Of course, we covered this in many different places, particularly in our bonding and grounding class, in video. We really covered it in more detail. I got to go quickly, so I apologize. If you don't understand, I can't answer some of these questions quickly. All right, so Brian, would you play this? We're down to, okay, but what about the ground rod at the lightning pole? There had to be a reason, Mike. Somewhere somebody did something. Does it protect the light fixture? So can you show us this video on the lightning so people can understand the concept? Okay.
Damn! Holy
Okay, is that like the coolest video of all time? What you really need to do, to be honest with you, is you got to go frame by frame, particularly in the slow motion, because when you see the lightning strike, you probably didn't catch it. But if you watch it again, you'll see that there's parts of the roof itself, metal parts of the roof itself is arcing. Because as the lightning is going down, it's called induction. It's inducing all kinds of voltage on all the metal parts. So there's purposes for grounding, but it's not for this reason here. So back to the question. Well, Mike, doesn't a ground rod pole serve something? Okay, Brian, can they see this image here? Okay, let's just imagine somewhere down here there is a light pole, and it has a light fixture on top of it. And there is this lightning bolt that comes down that you saw what it does to a friggin' tree, cuts it in half, and drops everything in there. Who knows what it did inside the house, in the building, as it decided collapsing on top of that electrically. Do you really think a ground rod at the bottom of a pole is going to protect that cute little LED fixture on the top of the pole? Come on, guys. Okay, Mike, we didn't have LED fixtures before. Okay, HID fixtures, high pressure sodium fixtures, do you really think? Of course not. People were driving ground rods because they thought that's what made it safe from electricity, because it was grounded. Grounding doesn't make anything safe. Bonding, as a matter of fact, if you notice my book is the only book that's titled Bonding and Grounding. Every other book is titled Grounding and Bonding, because the most important thing we have to do is what? Bonding. Now there is grounding requirements in the code, and you need to know those, and we've covered those many, many times already. All right, so no. How about this one? I found this, I don't know, 100-something foot tall pole with light fixtures all on the top of that. What, 12-inch-and-a-quarter bolts, anchors that go down maybe 18 feet into this massive concrete base. And look at this. There's this cute little ground wire. Are you kidding me? You got this thing bolted down with 12-inch-and-a-quarter bolts, and you seriously think there's going to be a design specification and it's going to show a ground rod or some kind of grounding scheme on the bottom of this pole? Oh my God. Guys, do you understand why I go crazy sometimes? This is why I go crazy, because I know theory. This is like, a lot of people don't understand theory. There's not, and the code says you don't need to do this. You need to bring what? An effective ground fault current path. Okay, now I got this comment from, we covered this a little bit a week or so ago, a couple weeks ago. Whether it's good or bad, Mike, contractors are responsible for building the project per the drawings and specifications. I would caution electricians not to make the decision not to drive a ground rod on their own, as it will end up in contractual problems later. Let's hope these rods go away in the future. I forgot the name of the gentleman. He's 100% right. That's what it shows on the plans. That's what you got to put it in there. One day, these dinosaur engineers that are showing all these, or the designers that are showing all these ground rods inside here, hopefully the younger guys are going to watch my videos. They're going to say, hey, you know, and they're going to become the boss one day. And they're going to say, you know how we can save some money in this job? How about we get rid of all these crazy ground rods around here? That's the deal on the light pole. Okay, we're done. Brian, do we have any comments? Let me get my coffee or my drink, my tea.
Well, I'll tell you, Mike, it's there've been a lot of people making comments, but I think more just a lot of excitement about a lot of what you're showing here. There's been some really, really great videos tonight. It's been very, very enjoyable.
It has been fun. I love it, guys, and I love you guys. So, all right, gonna finish up. We got another 35 minutes or so. We'll see. Might get done early unless my material's ready. Here we go. Ready? Oh, didn't type this out well. Sorry about that. All right, this has to do with multi-wire branch circuits. So, if you have this, I copy and paste off the email, so I didn't catch. So, if you have a 12-3 MC cable feeding two separate 115 motor circuits, you have to put that one on a double pole breaker, or can you use two single pole breakers and share the neutral? Okay, I did edit it, which is perfectly fine. I can't spell, and I don't know grammar, and it's the craziest thing is, I write books, you see right here, right? I write all these books, and it's okay, you don't have to spell no grammar, it doesn't really matter, because we're electricians, we don't even know if you spell right and grammar, we don't really care, okay? What it's saying is I got two motors, each 115 volts, I'm running 3 wires. Clearly we're going to share a neutral, is that right? The only question comes up is, well, do I put it on a 2-pole breaker, or can I put 2 single-pole breakers? So let's just kind of do a little review of multi-wire branch circuits, right? Okay. Probably should have got a definition of multi-wire branch circuit, but I'm making note that, add that. Okay, multi-wire branch circuit is when you have 2 hots in a neutral, or 3 hots in a neutral, and the voltage between, let's say this line 1 and the neutral, in this case here is 120, and the voltage between line 2 and the neutral, I like this graphic for that purpose, is going to be 120 microvolts, and I like this to be the graphic, and the voltage between line 1 and line 2 is 240. So a multi-wire branch circuit is where the line to neutral voltage are the same on all the circuits, and the line voltage is not equal to the line to neutral voltage. In other words, this is a 120, 240 volt single phase multi-wire branch circuit, if you understand what I'm talking about. Okay, so here is a neutral, line 1, line 2, an equipment grounding conductor, because this is Romex, that's going to be green, that's going to be bare. So this is 12-3, oh here we go, here example. So we could have shown 2 motors, or in this case here I'm showing 2 receptacles. So this would be the red, let's see, this is red and white for that one motor, let's say, and then the black and white for the other motor. Now, that's just talking about a multi-wire branch circuit. Each multi-wire branch circuit must have a means to simultaneously disconnect all phase conductors at the point where the branch circuit originates. This was a conversation I had with somebody earlier in the last few weeks. Simultaneously open it. If you put 2 single pole breakers there, then you cannot open both circuits simultaneously. So what you can do is you can put multi-wire branch must have a means to simultaneously disconnect. Okay, so you're going to simultaneously open it. See, there's another rule in there about open it simultaneously under a fault condition. This is opening it up mechanically. So 2 single pole breakers with an identified handle tie, mechanically open it up. This is kind of like for maintenance purposes. So just somebody can work on that circuit and know that they're both off. Now, 210.4b note is referencing 240.15b, which is another rule. So we're kind of talking in 210.4b that says, hey, there's a note, which is not a rule, telling you, listen, 240.15b tells us about this. So it's kind of like one code rule kind of letting you know about another code rule. And it says, look, individual single pole breakers with handle ties identified for the purpose, or a breaker with a common interrupt can be used for this application. So for a multi-wire branch circuit, you're either going to put 2 single pole breakers with identified handle ties, or it's going to be a common trip. Either way is fine. It doesn't have to be common trip. Let's go a little further on multi-wire branch circuit rules. The phase and neutral conductors of a multi-wire branch circuit must be identified or grouped together by cable ties or similar means at every enclosure. So we'd have to go to 200.4b also. So what you have to do is, now, if it's coming out of one, there's an exception. If you have a multi-wire branch circuit coming out of, let's go back here. Clearly, multi-wire branch circuit, we don't need to identify or group the multi-wire branch circuit because it's by itself. It's when you have more than one multi-wire branch circuit in a raceway, not likely to be in a cable, so in a raceway, well then you have to take the multi-wire branch circuit and you have to group it. So here's black, red, and white. We have to group that. Let's read this. I don't know if we have to group the black and white one here. I don't think so. The phase and neutral conductor of a multi-branch circuit must be identified and grouped together by cable ties. So we need, okay, so let's remove this cable tie on this graphic here. Don't need to identify, don't need to group that one. But over here, don't need to group this one here either because that's not a multi-wire branch circuit. Just the black, the red, and the white has to be grouped. And you'll see later on, and we've discussed this, we need to make sure that, see, the multi-wire branch circuit is a 120, 120, and it's 240, which means it's a common neutral. You got to have both those conductors on that breaker so that we can simultaneously open it. And that's why we have to group it, because think about this. If you're an electrician coming on a job site and you got two blacks, you got two whites, and a red, and you're going to put it on two breakers, a single pole breaker and a two pole breaker. Well, how are you going to know? How do you know? And then over here, you're in a junction box. And you got a multi-wire branch circuit and you got a non-multi-wire branch circuit. You got two blacks, a red, and two whites. Can you see the electricians could inadvertently, in this case right here, they could cross neutrals. Over here, they could not have the right black wire on the right phase. So now we're not simultaneously opening up that circuit, and also create some other problems that maybe we'll see, maybe not. This is the 240.15b1 rule that 210.4b1 note talked about. So this note is talking about this rule, which says individual one-pole breakers will identify handle ties are permitted for each phase conductor of a multi-wire branch circuit. So you can, but you can't use a nail. You can't use a 12-gauge wire. You can't use a 632. I'm not saying they don't work. I'm just saying that's not. See, the code says identified, which means the manufacturer makes this thing for that particular breaker, not listed. Oh, here we go. All right, so here's what you can't do. All right, and Brian, any questions on that?
Yeah, actually, Mike, we got a couple of comments. So just see a few comments about the handle tie not necessarily turning off both of the breakers. And could you just kind of, for a second, talk about tripping versus the purpose of the handle tie in this particular case with common trip versus just using the handle tie to kind of tie the breaker handles together? Just kind of review that because there seems to be a little confusion going on there.
All right, let's just look at this graphic here. Let's assume these are three single pole breakers, and it's going to be for a multi-wire branch circuit on three-phase. And you have an identified handle tie. Clearly, mechanically, by tying these three single pole breakers together, you can simultaneously, let's go back to the word simultaneously, each multi-branch circuit must have a means to simultaneously disconnect. There's a difference between disconnecting and opening because of an overcurrent condition. So back over here, and Brian, I don't know if you have time to download it, but we had a video in our video section that Eaton sent me about their single pole breaker with handle ties that it actually.
I'm going to jump on that right now and see if I can get that downloaded for you.
Okay. All right. So I was on a seminar, and Tom Dmitrovich from Eaton was one of my seminars. He's a big, important guy at Eaton. And I said this. I said, listen, guys, if you take a handle tie on the breakers here, I know for a fact Square D does. If one of these breakers have an overcurrent condition because of overload, short circuit, or ground fault, but one of these three-pole breakers would happen here, it would then open, but the other two phases, the other two poles would stay closed. And I made that as a general statement. And Tom said to me, well, Mike, I don't know. I think that our breakers, that when you put a handle tie, that when one opens, all of them are open. And if you know me a little bit, you know that I try to piss people off. Let's get there. Okay, let's short that. And what I do that for is I try to upset them so much that they're going to do all kinds of work to try to prove me wrong. And so Tom contacted his engineers while I'm doing a seminar. It's a 2-day EC&M seminar. And he got a video, and they showed me something. And here's what they said. I can't remember you probably guys will know when you look at the breaker. I think it's the CR breakers. That in Eaton Cutler Hammer CR breakers, okay, that when, it might be the CRs, and that when one opens, it will actually, because of an overcurrent condition, it will actually open all the breakers. Brian, you ready to show that video? All right. Okay, he's going to show that video there. And then, but just so you know, but the rule of multi-wire branch circuit is not to simultaneously open under an overcurrent condition. It's to simultaneously provide a disconnecting means to open the circuit. All right. So, you say it. You tell it, right? You say it. And so Tom gives me that in my seminar, and I play it in the classroom, saying, like I said, guys, some single pole breakers with a handle tie will open up all the other poles simultaneously under an overcurrent condition. So, Brian, do you think that might answer the question? Okay, let's watch that video again. So, by putting handle tie, does it make them alter trip? The answer is no. Does it have to make them alter trip? No. What matters is what? It's an identified handle tie. It's a multi-wire branch circuit. And if you don't understand why, it doesn't really matter. You need it on there because it's just to provide the simultaneous trip. Any other questions, Brian, at all? Anything on this?
Yeah, we've got a couple more comments, Mike. There was a comment here about, let's see, a standalone pole that has a solar panel feeding the light pole and no branch circuit brought to the pole with respect to the comment about installing a ground rod.
I'm not going to answer any solar questions because solar is a total different world. So I tell you what, if you guys are into solar, and you're like, man, you never answer these solar questions. Number one, that's the first one asked. Number two, I didn't answer. You might want more solar questions answered. Then what I suggest you do is you send me a bunch of questions on solar. I did get one recently about, hey Mike, can the DC circuit conductors to an inverter and the AC circuit conductors be mixed together in the same wireway? So I'll be answering that. So solar questions. We'll cover.
All right, I got one fun comment before you move on, and that was from Brian Rock.
Okay.
And I'm sure you probably knew this.
Hey, Brian.
He said that the actual investigation of that Iraq deal was done by Joe Tedesco. Is that did you know that?
That's probably not true. Only because I was involved in the Iraqi case, and I was actually the person that they sent me cases and cases and cases of documentation on that. That was KBR. It was a $26 billion contract. They were charged with, going to be charged with manslaughter, and they were going to be kicked out, and they contacted me in a panic, and I actually had a 3-star general from KBR at my house. And I won't tell you the story, but I did strangle the guy. I actually put my hand on the 3-star general, but that's a whole other story. So Joe Tedesco was not involved in that case, but Joe Tedesco did go to Iraq, and he was with KBR at some level. But when the actual case came inside here, I was involved in that. So, but Joe's a super guy, but he wasn't involved in that particular case in the litigation that I got involved in. But I tell you the story on that one, that case in Iraq was very fascinating because when I started reading all the documentations and all the depositions, I told my wife, I said, you know, this guy, the guy who wrote this whole report, which was not Joe Tedesco, this guy, like, he understands. bonding and grounding. I mean, this is like the craziest thing. I come to find out years later, I did a seminar in Denver, Colorado, and I was bringing this scenario up again, and the guy raised his hand. He goes, Mike, he goes, I don't even remember me. I'm like, I don't know. A lot of people out there remember. He says, but I was the one that wrote that report. I'm like, really? I said, I have to ask you a question. You wrote the report like it was like I taught you. He goes, Mike, you don't remember? You sent all of us out there in Iraq free, bonding and grounding, DVDs, and books. We ate it all up so that when we went out there to do the investigation, we were ready. I'm like, oh, now the deposition, all the documents make sense. So that's a little history there. Close, but Joe Tedesco, my buddy, super guy, he was out there, and he was with KBR, because I know they called me and asked me about whether they should hire him or not. And I said, sure, just be careful with the camera. All right, I'm done with that. I'm moving on to the next one. Overhead service conductors. Now, if you watch any of my videos, you know Eric Stromberg's on there, and he has all his groupie followers. And Eric and I, whenever we get together, we're playing all the time. And this is something that drives Eric Stromberg completely crazy. So let's get into this scenario. Hey, Mike, what's the code requirements for service conductors over a driveway or a walkway? Well, the number one thing we have to learn is we have to go to the code book, which I don't have time to get into, and we got to find out what's a service. We got to find out what's a service point. We got to know what is a service drop. We got to know what service conductors are, overhead service conductors, underground service conductors, lateral service conductors, and service conductors, and all that stuff. You ready? I'll make it simple. The utility is shown here in blue. With me? That's utility. Just making a statement, okay? The utility shown here in blue is not part of the code. So if this question had to do with service drop conductors, what would be the height of this? We don't really care. If the utility's putting it in, we don't get involved. We don't care what's going on. So let's get that clarified. So when you're talking about service conductors over a walkway or a driveway, well, I'm like, well, the only conductors you could be talking about service conductors over anything or under anything or next to something would be the conductors where the utility has said, hey, listen, we're going to give you 75 feet of wire. We're going to go to a pole and we're going to stop. And that's all we're going. And I've had that at a house, you know, in the country. They'll do that very common. They'll just give you a drop to the first pole. And then after that, you run your own conductor. So now this yellow is within the scope of the NEC. This blue is not within the scope of the NEC. Let's get that established first of all. And then of course we're in 230.10. We can't use trees for the support of overhead service conductors. Right. So that takes care of the first part. Now, again, if the utility is installing them, when they stop and their drop, then after that, so when you get to the code book and they talk about all these heights over walkways and driveways and all that other stuff, they're talking about you installing service conductors, which is probably not likely. You might be installing feeder conductors. Well, that's going to be 225, I think 225.18, which is something we could talk about if somebody wanted us to get into it at some other time. So if we go to 230.24b, they do talk about roads. And I didn't open it up. I probably should have snagged the text. I didn't. Roads are going to be like heavy vehicular traffic. It's going to be 18 feet. It all has to do with voltages, you know, whether it's going to be 122, 240, it's going to be, whether it's going to be 277, 480. So there's some voltages given in there. And my class is only under 600 volts. 277, 480 is the maximum that I would be talking about here. Canadians, they go up to 347, 600, but that's on the north side of the border. And if you have a driveway, it's going to be 12 feet. And if you have just simply from, not a driveway, just from grade, the overhead service conductors are going to be 10 feet. Highly unlikely that you're installing overhead service conductors. So let's make sure when we have a question, we know what we're talking about. Now, there is a rule on 230.26 about the point of attachment. And that rule says that the point of attachment for overhead service conductors must not be less than 10 feet above the finished grade. So now we should make this in blue, Mike Howard. We'll make that blue. That means that's utility conductors. And we can make this, we don't have to make anything. And that's your service point. That, by the way, service point is where the utility ends and where you begin. It's not that complicated. That's your service point. Wire to wire. So then you have a point of attachment. So the thing is though, who's putting in the point? Brian, you got more experience than I do on this. Who puts in the point of attachment? Do they ever? Does utility ever actually go to the?
Sure.
Conduit?
Yeah. I mean,
Where?
it varies by
riser?
area. To be honest with you, there are many areas that we've worked in over the years where we're required to put in a point of attachment, especially on if it is overhead to a commercial service, then the utilities want an engineered point of attachment. Residential, it just varies by utility, and yeah, they do sometimes come in and attach directly to the riser, to the service mast.
So you're saying you physically put something mechanically
sure.
there
Yes.
for the utility?
Yeah, for
is
sure.
that right?
And some states actually,
when
in
you get a
fact,
chance.
require it. If I'm not mistaken, and I have to remember because that was a while ago when I took my Washington State exam, they actually have a detail included as one of the questions on the exam of exactly how the mast has to be installed and braced and where the point of attachment. I mean, there's some areas where they're very specific about this.
Well, you know what I'd like if anybody is watching this, take a picture of it, of the fitting. That's what I want to see, a fitting. I want to see a fitting, not something that's up there. Go landscape, take a picture and send it to Mike and MikeHolt.com, because when I was electrical contractor, I just put the weatherhead up to the roof and then I left. I didn't go out there and put something mechanically there so whenever they want to come back to it, they could. But if you actually mechanically do that, and well then you got to comply with the code. You got to be 10 feet off the ground. If the utility comes by after I put my weatherheads in there, I don't care what they did, I don't care where they put it. So remember, is it utility or is it not? All right, going to 23028A. Brian, this is right down the street from you, where we go mountain biking there in Ocala, in Santos. And here's what it says. If a mast is used for overhead conductor support, it must have adequate mechanical strength, braces or guide wires to withstand the strain caused by the conductors. Well, I couldn't get any closer. I tried to get as close as I could to this house. I had to zoom in on my phone. Probably could do a better job with my 11 Pro Max phone. But, so there is going to be some kind of guide wire. Now, the National Code does not get into what it is. And Brian, I think you started to say something, and that is that Washington themselves have it in their Washington administrative, I don't know if it's an administrative code, I don't know what Washington calls that, their own little rules in there. But the utilities oftentimes, probably they always do, have specific details on guide wires, on the size of the pipe, how tall it can be, and everything. So if you're not familiar with this, make sure you download. I know Florida Power Light called it the Blue Book, Brian, wasn't that called?
Yeah, there's
like that?
Blue Book
I know
and
the
Green
city
Book and Orange Book, and just depends on what utility is and where you're at. And I mean, now you just get a PDF and they tell you this size service needs this.
Well, in Leesburg, a little city where my office is, and we're in Florida, it's a little city utility. The city of Leesburg has their own electrical utility distribution system. Well, they have their individual books on. So code talks about guide wires as far as you need to have them, but not how to mechanically do it. Brian, you have a lot more experience in this. How do you get do you get an engineered guide wire? Can you do something? Can you actually call somebody to get something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like they just specify the type of cable that you're going to use, the size of the bolt, usually the thickness and the angle iron, where it's got to be out on the building, and what type of, whether it's compression fitting or whatever. It might be a high press crimp or whatever they decide they want you to use to attach it on.
Okay. All right, I got it. All right, service mast, since we're still talking about the service mast, conductors cannot be attached to a mast between a weatherhead or the end of a conduit and a coupling. So here's your coupling, for kind of obvious reasons, right? You can't put the point of attachment above the coupling. And by the way, we're not getting into it. Service conductors have to have a minimum height. You know that we talked about the height over a walkway, driveway, street, okay, service overhead conductors? Well, these are not overhead conductors, but these are service conductors. Brian, Mike Corbett, make this blue here. This black, red, and white part right here, that is going to have to maintain a certain height above grade, walkways, driveways, and things like that. Same thing here. And also there are rules about how high over a roof what's the height, the minimum height over roof that the service conductors. And there's locations about weatherheads and the point of attachment. So, you know, get your code book out. You know, some of the stuff is just fun. I mean, why not just jump into 230, go in there and start looking about point of attachments and weatherheads, and these are mechanical things that just, it's good to know that you know what you're doing. It's easy, it's not a big deal. All right, wow. I'm done. I didn't prepare any further than that. We went a little faster than I thought I was gonna go, so, maybe there's some questions.
Well, yeah, we got a few comments. Eric had to jump in there and just clarify about the service point. The service conductor start at the service point. You did end up coming back around to that. And then, so both the service drop and the service lateral are not service conductors. So yes, Eric, we hear you. He's getting real technical, and that's right. He's splitting some hairs with us. And we got a few other questions that I think are going to be better addressed maybe in one of the other sessions because they're kind of off topic. But I think that's about it for tonight.
Okay, well, listen, I got feeder tap rules, all kinds of good stuff. That's what are we doing feeder tap? Today is what? All right, so tomorrow is going to be Wednesday. Tomorrow I'm covering becoming a journeyman electrician. What do you need to do as far as attitude? What do you need to do as far as experience? What do you need to do as far as knowledge? How much time do you have to spend? Brian, I need to get that time from you. How much time do you have to spend to train for it? What do you do in level 1, 2, 3, 4, like year 1, 2, 3? This has to do with if you're not in an apprenticeship training program. If you're in an apprenticeship training program, whether it be IBEW, or whether it's going to be IEC, or you're in a community college or a high school, you're in a program, then this is nothing that you would need to know about tomorrow because it has to be a journeyman. And that's what we're coming tomorrow. Everything about a journeyman. So bring your questions. And if somebody's working for you and they're wondering about taking a test or they're wondering about studying, what should I do as an electrician? I'm in the trade 6 months, or I'm in the trade 2 years or 3 years. Where do I go? What do I do? And I'm not in a program. So tomorrow is for those people. So please have those guys watch. God bless.